Britain's news channel.
The Jubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Good morning and welcome to Sunday with Michael Portillo. Luxuriate in a late morning lather of arts, culture, politics and good conversation. We'll start with our weekly politics review, examining the entrails of 2 seismic by-elections for clues as to what might happen at a general election next year. Labour is celebrating. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, is said to fear a Portillo moment in the newly formed constituency of Godalming and Ash. That means the humiliation of a cabinet minister being ousted from the Commons, a phenomenon linked to my name after an unfortunate incident back in 1997. We'll look at the horrendous conflict in the Middle East, where the death toll is bound to get worse. A ground invasion of Gaza is, we're led to believe, imminent. I'll be speaking to a reservist IDF commander about that bloody prospect. And will the war against Hamas distract Western attention from Russia's invasion of Ukraine? The Biden administration and our own Boris Johnson seek to link the 2 conflicts in the minds of Western opinion makers. Retired British Army Colonel Richard Kemp will give me his view. The actor Kevin Spacey, who was earlier this year acquitted of charges of sexual assault, made a surprise appearance at the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford. His recitation from Shakespeare's Timon of Athens moved an audience which was there to remember the philosopher Roger Scruton and to denounce modern cancel culture. GB News' Emma Webb was in the audience and will be here to reflect on the performance. And talking of theatre and theatricality, our resident critic Stephen Kyriazis has been busy, a busy bee all week, buzzing around 3 shows, including a ballet. Later in the programme, I'll be asking what should be done with the land that was purchased by the government for that chunk of the HS2 railway that's now been cancelled. And we reflect on Trafalgar Day. I'll be joined by a man who's probably come closer to the conditions endured by Nelson's sailors than anyone else alive. All of that is to come, but first your news headlines with Sophia Wensler.
Good morning. It's 2 minutes past 11. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. Israel has issued an urgent warning to residents in northern Gaza, telling them to move south. It follows another night of airstrikes, with medical sources saying more than 50 Palestinians were killed. Leaflets and phone messages warn those who stay in the north could be seen as sympathisers with a terrorist organisation and are putting their lives at danger. Former Israeli ambassador to the UK, Daniel Taub, says Israel is not targeting civilians.
We have been working very closely with the international community to try and make sure that supplies humanitarian access reaches the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip, particularly in the south. But we're also aware that to date, in the 16 years since Israel pulled out of every inch of the Gaza Strip, humanitarian aid, and that's including European aid, has been hijacked and abused by the Hamas terrorist organization.
Head of the Palestinian diplomatic mission to the UK, Manuel Hassiassian, says he still believes in two-state solution.
And don't try to put us, all in a frame that we are terrorists as Palestinians. There is a difference between the Palestinian people who want peace and security, and there is a difference between the Palestinian Authority, which is the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, who believe in a two-state solution, who have condemned violence all along. The question is, can Israel stop state terrorism on equal basis?
The United Nations says a second convoy of aid could be delivered to Gaza today. 20 trucks were allowed to enter the Strip when the Rafah crossing on the border with Egypt was opened for a few hours yesterday. The UN says 100 trucks are needed each day to meet the essential needs of the Palestinians. Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick says diplomacy is key.
What we should be doing is using the assets of the UK, which is our relationships with countries like Egypt and Israel, and our development aid to support as many vulnerable people as possible in Gaza, rather than creating small schemes to privilege a small number of people. The priority is to get the British nationals out and humanitarian aid in a way which means it is not diverted and abused by the terrorist organisation Hamas.
People believe a woman in her 80s has died as a result of flooding in Chesterfield. The discovery of her body brings the total number of people who've died during Storm Babette to 4. Floods are still affecting parts of the UK, including Yorkshire, Scotland, East Anglia and the East Midlands. The Environment Agency says there are 3 severe flood warnings in place in Derbyshire. Manchester United will open a book of condolence for fans at Old Trafford following the death of Sir Bobby Charlton. He was a key member of England's World Cup winning team in 1966. United players wore a black armband for their game against Sheffield United last night. The club says he will always be remembered as a giant of the game. Former England manager Sam Allardyce paid tribute to his kindness.
He was a great ambassador for Manchester United and a great ambassador for football and England, and such a kind person. I think that's what everybody as tribute is explaining to what a great guy he was, what a contribution he made to football for England and for Manchester United. And of course, as a youngster, I watched him in the World Cup final on my black and white TV at the time all those years ago. But it was a pleasure to know him. Every time I went to Old Trafford, he'd stop and have a chat with you.
This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on your digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back to Michael.
Thank you very much, Sophia Wensler. When the Tories lost 2 by-elections a few months ago, they were consoled by narrowly holding on to Uxbridge, probably by opposing the Labour Mayor of London's plans to tax polluting vehicles. Some Conservatives believe that it pointed the way to a policy shift, reducing the rigour of environmental policy. The Prime Minister has indeed delivered important changes, but despite that, the party can find no solace after being trounced in the by-elections at Tamworth and Mid-Bedfordshire. Labour overturned 2 huge majorities. So has the electorate already decided next year's election result? Reports suggest that Jeremy Hunt fears a Portillo moment in his Surrey constituency, and to avoid such a savage humiliation won't stand at all. But is there yet something that the Conservatives can play for? To opine on that very simple question, I welcome Mark Lehane from the Centre for Policy Studies, formerly Special Advisor to Nadine Zahawi, Peter Edwards, who's the former editor of Labour List, and the former Labour Government Minister, Dennis McShane. Peter, the swings this week were very significant indeed. Labour needs to have a result even better than Tony Blair's result in 1997. But these swings actually put it on the path to having a majority. So in the Labour Party, are people now pretty confident of victory?
No, I think they're pretty confident that we're on a level playing field and we've got a good chance. And I think the stats you quoted just then show why both main parties have reasons to fear. Of course, in Tamworth and Mid-Bedfordshire, the swings were very high. One of them was the second largest post-war. But as you said, Labour's starting point with around 200 MPs in the House of Commons now is so bad. So I think in Labour, the mood is very good because, you know, Keir Starmer sorted out the party. And to be frank, there is an element of watching the Conservative government not just self-destruct, but self-destruct while prosecuting a culture war, which seems doomed to failure because of demographic change. But, you know, in my lifetime, I'm 42, Labour have lost an awful lot of elections, so it is absolutely not a done deal.
I admire your natural caution. I think it's a very appropriate position. People were quite impressed by the Labour Party conference because they saw a great deal of unity at a time when Labour has passed through some quite difficult issues, Israel being one of them. What do you draw from that? For example, Starmer has taken a very strong position, which has been in favour of Israel's right to defend itself, and that means, in this case, to retaliate against Hamas. Did you feel that was putting strains on the party, or do you think this has been a proof of how well the party is doing in unity terms?
I mean, I think it asks the question of membership, and I'm sure everyone here today would all accept that the horror in the Middle East is so great in itself that it obviously trumps party political concerns in Westminster. But there was a moment when Labour Party began just days after this wicked terrorist attack by Hamas that you thought what would the reaction be of the Labour membership. But Keir Starmer came out very quickly and really in lockstep with Richie Sunak condemned Hamas for the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. And we've got to keep reminding ourselves how bad it was. And that, to you and I, that's not contentious to put it in those terms because it was such a horrendous event. And it was not contentious at Labour conference because I think the mood of the party and the membership of the party changed and they were accepting of what Keir Starmer said on Israel.
Mark, we hear there about a lack of contention, a unity within the Labour Party, a party that is subduing its differences because it's determined to win, which is very different from the Conservative Party, which continues to advertise its differences. What prospect of the Conservative Party being more united between now and the election day, do you think?
Well, I mean, we're still at least probably a year away from the election, and at any point over the last few years, I don't think anyone's been able to accurately predict what a year's time would be like. And I think as we approach the point where an election is going to be called, people will focus in again on that public unity. But the Conservative Party's always been a broad church. You know that. It's been made up of lots of people with lots of different ideas about how we should do stuff. And when you're in government, you actually get to make those big calls. You're not just talking about what you would do, you're talking about what you should do. And I think it's only natural, given everything the country's been through, with all those big shocks like COVID and Ukraine and stuff like that, that people are debating what the right thing to do next is.
I have known the party for a long time, and it is a broad church. It's also very often a divided party, and when it's a divided party, it quite often loses. That's certainly what happened in 1997. We were very, very divided. I was quite struck by a point that Peter made there. Peter assumed that to pursue the woke issue would be a vote loser for the Conservatives. I'm not sure that I agree with him, and I wonder whether you do.
So I don't think it's something that should be front and centre of what the Conservatives are campaigning on. But let's be clear, all that these woke issues are about is common sense responses to difficult situations. And the centre of gravity, if you like, around most people in the Conservative Party is exactly where the public are. My background is teaching. I was a head teacher and a teacher for 15 years. The stuff the government is working on, for instance, around transgender guidance for schools, that won't be the kind of thing that's on people talk about on the doorsteps. But for families who've got children in schools and for people that work in schools, and that's a lot of people, about 800,000 people, that's a really big issue. So I think provided the government does the right thing on those things, doesn't make it divisive, but just makes it common sense and practical, that will resonate with people. But they have to deliver on the other stuff as well, like cost of living, immigration and stuff like that.
Dennis McShane, does it feel like 1996 to you?
Not quite, because Tony Blair undoubtedly was a very charismatic leader, much more so, if I may say so, Michael, than Margaret Thatcher. People back-project the famous Thatcher who arrived by the end of the 1980s. Mrs. Thatcher in the 1970s was quite a cautious centrist politician. She imposed comprehensive schools everywhere, which wasn't popular with the Tory right. She was very pro-European. I remember her wearing that wonderful sweater with all the colourful flags of Europe on it. But after the Falklands War, and then after the necessary defeat of Arthur Scargill because he embarked on a battle of the Somme against the British people, the British state, then she became the great figure. Tony was already there.
So may I interrupt you on that point and say to you, are you saying that Starmer is as charismatic as Margaret Thatcher was in 1979?
About the same, I'd say. He's very professional, like she was, very well prepared. Occasionally she would dare a joke, but usually get it wrong. Sir Keir tends to avoid jokes. I mean, he's a trained, high-grade lawyer. He's middle of the road. He's a solution solver, and he is not given to any kind of excitement. I've tracked him a little bit, and I think that's what people want. We've had, frankly, too much excitement from the Conservative Party in the last 5 or 6 years. Too many prime ministers, too many policies going left or right or up or down. And people are fed up with it. And Rishi Sunak, who seems a decent head boy of Winchester in an average year, isn't really, I think, cutting it as a person of the people.
Let me try that on Peter. So the idea is that we don't want any excitement. But I, as a voter, am exasperated by the fact that nothing in Britain works. You know, whether you're talking about the railways or the health service or whatever. But I would quite like to hear from someone who's going to tell me how Britain is going to be made to work in the future. And I'm unimpressed by anyone who's not talking about fundamental reform. Do you agree with Dennis that that is a subject that should be avoided by Keir Starmer?
I don't think you can win while avoiding that subject, but I think where the public have really settled on the 3 issues that are going to decide the election, which are really economy, cost of living, which is often the case, something around small boats, and then really pick one more public services. But for me, it would be NHS waiting times. And to go to the culture war point, you know, I was campaigning in mid-Bedfordshire a week or so ago, and I said to a trans woman activist, you know, I said, really want you to be treated with dignity, but this is not something that comes up every day on the doorstep. And she said, I agree, absolutely. It's those 3 things. It's NHS and cost of living and small boats that come up on the doorstep, and not the quote-unquote culture war it is. And I think, again, the other question always asked by folk like you is, how, if you're leader of the opposition, how can you go from being, well, the other lot of rubbish will try you, to a positive agenda? And that's why Labour will need answers on those key policy areas. So I think the house-building announcements at conference were the start of that. We need a bit more.
Mark, I rather agree with Peter that those are going to be the issues. The cost of living should be quite a bit better by election day than it is today. Do you think there's any chance that the small boats position will be any better?
Well, we're obviously waiting to hear what the Supreme Court's got to say about the Rwanda policy, haven't we? And if they come out in favour of the government stance and that policy, then very quickly you might see people being flown to Rwanda and the numbers coming across the channel changing. That would be a big win for the government. But it's kind of out of their hands if what the Supreme Court do. Now, of course, if the Supreme Court rule against that, they've got other options, and that might not be a bad battle for them to have. But I think you're right. The big issues are the cost of living, they are immigration, and probably the NHS. This last week, we've seen data come through where wages are rising faster than inflation for the first time in a long time. If that could carry on for another year, people might feel better in their pocket in a year's time and might feel more generous towards the government. But I don't think that people have already made their mind up. I think lots of people have switched off. They've got lives to get on with. We've had a lot of excitement for various reasons, probably since 2014 and the Scottish referendum. And I think people want less excitement and just want to get on with their lives.
Dennis, you've been scrunching your face. How do I interpret this scrunched face?
No, very simply, I don't think small boats are really that... All Rwanda's irrelevant. We can send a plane load or two. I remember David Blunkett phoning me up and screaming at me, Dennis, I've got 130 illegal Brazilians on an airplane at Bryce Norton. I want to ship them out and show how tough we are on illegal immigration. But the Brazilians won't let me land my plane. And so I phoned up the Brazilian Foreign Minister, mate, and said, you know, por favor, or please. He said, no, Dennis, we're not having your guy humiliating our citizens citizens. They went on a tourist visa. Yeah, maybe they kind of stretched it a little bit in cafes and so on, and restaurants. They can come back one by one. We're not denying Britain's right to expel them, but we're not having this giant publicity stunt to humiliate the people of Brazil. Well, David was on holiday in Mallorca, so I said, I think you better just enjoy the holiday, David. You're not going to get much out of this. But on Rwanda, you know, the Israelis sent a lot of people to Rwanda, and they said, thank you very much, waited a couple of weeks, and went back to Israel. We're not going to have, you know, armed guards, I mean, the SAS sort of gunning them down if they leave their accommodation in Rwanda. We won't send very many. The Danes have looked at it very seriously. It's an unworkable idea, and it won't make any... The big thing is a huge increase in permitted immigration. We were told leaving Europe would reduce the flow of foreigners into Britain. We've got more from India, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines than ever before. At some stage, that's going to emerge. It might be one for the ex-Brexit party, the Reform Party.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much indeed. That was Mark Leon, Peter Edwards and Dennis McShane. In a few minutes, we'll turn our attention to Israel. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner will join me to explain the next step for the Israeli Defence Forces in Gaza.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. I'm Craig Snell. Well, looking ahead to today, most of us, it's a much drier picture. Still a few showers around, and that's all courtesy of this rather complex area, low pressure. But the main area of low pressure, which has been responsible for the very heavy rain over the last few days, has now finally cleared to the north. So as I mentioned, most of us are largely dry, some good spells of sunshine, especially across eastern parts of the country. Further west, a few showers. Some of these could potentially be on the heavy side, especially across the very far south of England, and quite blustery too still for the very far north of Scotland. But for most of us, temperatures around where they should be for the time of year, 10s to 12s in Scotland, potentially up to around 15 or 16 degrees in southern England. So as we go into this evening, clearing skies across the board, so a recipe for a clear and chilly night. Could turn quite frosty for Scotland, and after the very wet weather what we've had here, we could see some icy patches too, maybe also parts of northern England, and just watching out for a few showers for Northern Ireland. So starting Monday morning, watch out for some icy stretches for parts of Scotland and Northern England. But most of us starting dry. A few mist and fog patches first thing. Still the risk of some showers for Northern Ireland, maybe just creeping into parts of Western Cornwall too. But I think for most of us, it should be a dry and bright day. And once again, temperatures around where they should be for the time of year. 10s to 12s in the north, potentially 16 in the south.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Ah!
No, thank you. My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Welcome back. 2 weeks have passed since the horrific attacks on Israeli civilians and citizens by Hamas, and the world holds its breath, awaiting the next move by the Israeli Defense Forces. After pummeling targets inside Gaza, it's assumed that their highly risky ground incursion cannot be long postponed. To give us some insight, I'm pleased to be joined by Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, one of the many reservists who's returned to active duty with the IDF. Peter, thank you for joining us on GB News from, I think, Tel Aviv. I was just saying that the ground offensive cannot be long postponed, but I wonder whether I've got that right. I mean, it seems to me that it is such a risky operation that maybe it will still be a long time coming. What do you think?
So here's what we know. Day 16 of our operation, Michael, is in the stage of intensifying our strikes against Hamas, their infrastructure, their leaders, their operators, everything that they have utilized from their position of a government of Gaza in order to subordinate it to the act or the brutal massacre of so many Israelis on the 7th of October. So the ground operation is potentially there. We are, mobilizing reservists. 300,000 reservists is the largest recruiting of reservists in the history of the IDF. And so when we look, we are taking the necessary preparations in order to be ready for a green light from the government, and that when the operational terms and conditions are aligned with the broader goals of our operation. So I'd say what we're doing now currently is training, equipping, making sure that each and every unit knows what their task will be if the green light is given.
You don't need telling that, of course, if one's trying to find any joined-up thinking in what Hamas has done, it is to lure Israel into various traps. One, to retaliate at a level which goes beyond what global opinion will tolerate. Another, to end the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And another, to lure the Israeli Defense Forces into Gaza, where in a situation of urban warfare, they could be massacred. But I'm sure you're very aware of those multiple traps.
Well, while the threat and challenge of every defense force, every military force operating in urban warfare, especially against a merciless enemy like Hamas, is, of course, of concern and a challenge, we only have to look back 2 weeks and 1 day now to realize what they've already done to our people. So really, they've left us not only with no choice, but no other option. And when they came into our bedrooms and butchered our babies, they basically sealed their own destiny of being banished from the realm of existence. Indeed, when we mobilize, if we mobilize on the ground and seek out Hamas, there is a chance that there will be casualties on our side, but we will operate in order to make sure that they never, ever have that power of government, a terrorist government, a government that utilizes all of its powers to build a horrific force, instructs those horrific forces to conduct brutal massacres, executions, rape, abduction, they can't ever have that power again. So it's sometimes in some of the other news channels there, people keep it's an issue of revenge. This isn't a war of retribution. It's a war of existence, because this terrorist organization is trying to set a new norm for terror against Israel. But they're also sending a message to terrorist organizations around the world that this is what we do in order to achieve our political goals. And terrorism is exactly that. And that is why we are determined to make sure that our people will be never threatened again by this organization. And even if there are local ramifications with regard to our operations within Gaza, but also regional, and the threat of Hezbollah is also a substantial threat. And that's why we are taking those precautions in order to be prepared on all fronts. But nevertheless, the paradigm that has existed for the last 16 or 17 years since Hamas came to power in Gaza has to change.
I feel sure that Israel has good intelligence, for example, on the network of tunnels, which is said to run under Gaza. But on the other hand, one must have some doubts, because there has clearly been a dramatic and historic failure of Israeli intelligence for those attacks of 2 weeks ago to have occurred.
So, as you said in my introduction, they called me up for reserve duty. And while this surprise was a strategic surprise with regard to Hamas's intentions, there have not been any tactical surprises, because we knew about the Nukhba forces that they were building. We've seen them training, we know the magnitude, we know how many, what type of weapons they have. We know about their explosive drones. We know about their different rocket capabilities. We know where they're hiding out. As you implied, we know how extensive their tunnel mechanisms is and how they are operating and using them. So we're confident we have good intelligence, but the realm of warfare is it's not the known knowns, it's the unknown knowns. And so we know that we have a brutal enemy. We don't know exactly what they're doing. We have a good grasp of their operational capabilities, and we need to confront that and remove that as if it was a tumor.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner. Let us hope that in whatever happens next, the death toll may be just as low as can possibly be. The United States has made clear that it stands behind Israel's mission to eradicate Hamas, and in an address from the Oval Office, President Biden explicitly linked the causes of Israel and Ukraine as two democracies fending off aggression. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson echoed the point in an article in the Daily Telegraph. Are those two statesmen fearful that the conflict in the Middle East could distract attention from Ukraine? To answer that, I'm joined by Colonel Richard Kemp, formerly of the British Army, who also joins us from Israel. Richard, the fact is that this is distracting attention, the attention of the West, from the Ukrainian war.
It's not only distracting attention, it's also deflecting resources, particularly American resources. As we know, there are two US carrier strike groups in the Eastern Mediterranean, and undoubtedly some of the resources that they're using would have been and other US assets would have been directed towards helping Ukraine, particularly in terms of surveillance. But in addition to that, the Americans have been delivering and continue to deliver a significant amount of munitions to Israel, some of which are artillery shells, which Israel may well need either in Gaza or if it has to carry out an offensive into Lebanon, some of which was earmarked for Ukraine. And indeed, large American stockpiles of ammunition earlier on this year were sent to Ukraine from Israel. They've been based in Israel for exactly this eventuality and went to Ukraine. Now, that some of that is now coming back to Israel. And in addition to that, I think one other important factor is that, as we know, one of the political elements, particularly on the right in the United States of America, has opposed continued US support to Ukraine. And I imagine, and I've already seen some evidence of it, that some of those people are saying it's essential we support Israel, and this is the reason why we can't support Ukraine, because Israel needs our support more than Ukraine does. And so I think that's having an effect and will have a future effect on US support in Ukraine.
If that is what is being said on the right in United States politics, that they weren't very keen on continuing to support Ukraine either, and that the war with Hamas now means even more so that those people want to support Israel rather than Ukraine, what will be the reaction on the left of American politics? What will be the reaction of President Biden? Will he want to see a peace between Russia and Ukraine, let's say between now and the election?
Well, I think that was always on Biden's agenda. I think from my reading of it, he was always intending to push Ukraine into coming to some kind of accommodation with Russia before the US election. So let's say by the middle of next year. And obviously that's not on Zelensky's agenda. But of course, Ukraine depends so heavily on US support that if the United States threatened or suggested that they would minimize or even stop any further support for Ukraine, then it might leave Zelensky with no choice other than to come to accommodation with Putin, if, of course, Putin was willing to go along with that as well. And that, I think, would mean, from my understanding, would mean that Russia would hang on to pretty much all the territory it's got now in Ukraine, and Ukraine would have no resources to push back on that, and would be effectively be left with a frozen conflict along lines that are probably not totally dissimilar from what we've got now. And of course, I think Putin wants that. I think that's partly Putin's objective. And I think we have to consider the hand of Russia in this war in the Middle East as well. You mentioned the objectives of Hamas and Iran in disrupting Middle East peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel and other objectives. But I think we shouldn't forget the close alliance between Russia and Iran. Iran's been supplying a large amount of drones to kill civilians in Ukraine, supplying them to Russia. Russia, in turn, has been providing Iran with a great deal of money and also sophisticated military resources. Hamas, Hezbollah, and Islamic Jihad fighting against Israel have got strong links with Russia as well. And Hamas and Islamic Jihad leaders both met with Putin and his subordinates in Moscow in recent months. So I think we shouldn't ignore that aspect as well.
Richard, I think that's a really useful insight into the global politics of all this. Thank you so much for being on GB News. Audience members at the Roger Scruton Memorial Lecture in Oxford last week were surprised to be entertained by fallen Hollywood royalty when Kevin Spacey appeared and delivered a stirring performance of a Shakespeare soliloquy. Douglas Murray had delivered the lecture on cancel culture and introduced Spacey, whose acting career was torpedoed 6 years ago after he was accused of sexual assault. He's since been acquitted of all charges. The two-time Oscar winner and former director of the Old Vic Theatre delivered a passage from Timon of Athens about a man who is abandoned by his friends after falling on hard times. Let's take a look at this performance.
But myself, who had the world as my confectionery, the world, the mouths, the tongues, the eyes, and the hearts of men at duty more than I could frame employment, that numberless upon me stuck as the leaves do on the oak, and have with one winter's brush fallen from their boughs and left me open, naked for every storm that blows. I to bear this that never knew but better is some burthen, a burthen thy nature did commence in sufferance.
Amongst those in the audience was the UK director of the Common Sense Society, Emma Webb, who's also a GB News contributor, and she joins me now. Did you feel goosebumps at the time, and do you feel them now?
Yes. In fact, I'm amazed that I've watched that performance now a number of times after watching it in person, and still get goosebumps on my arms and my legs. It was such a powerful performance. And for me, as someone, I know there are obviously a lot of people in the crowd, because most people do know Kevin Spacey's work. I'm not much of a film watcher, and so I hadn't, at least knowingly, seen any of his films before that performance. And so for me, the real treat was in seeing someone perform Shakespeare so well, because it's so hard to come by a good performance of Shakespeare, and it has been for a very long time. And it hit me like a train, because it was so powerful and such an exquisite performance.
So if you heard that Kevin Spacey was performing Timon of Athens in a theatre, let's say in London, would you buy a ticket?
Now I would. Before, it wouldn't have. I mean, I probably would have gone just simply because Timon of Athens is not a play that is often performed. In fact, I'm aware that there was one, I think, about 5 years ago. But it's very rare that play's put on. It's quite a niche Shakespeare play. I think it's very, as we saw in that performance, is very relevant to the time that we're living in. So certainly, if there was a performance of that now, I would be in the queue to get tickets before they were even on sale.
That soliloquy was very relevant to Kevin Spacey's recent experiences, and also relevant to what happened to Roger Scruton. Now, it was the Roger Scruton Memorial Lecture. Tell us what happened to Roger Scruton.
So I think that was one of the reasons why Kevin Spacey's performance was such a perfect climax to Douglas's beautiful tribute to Roger's life and to his work, but particularly ending on, as Roger's life did end on, a sad note of what happened to him with the New Statesman. So there was a young journalist, I believe it was George Eaton, who did an interview with him for the New Statesman. I think Roger had actually worked for the New Statesman or written for them previously, and they did this hit job on him. Douglas was incredible in managing to procure the recording of this interview to show that Roger hadn't said the things that the New Statesman had claimed that he'd said. And so they tried...
literally hadn't said them, or simply the context was different?
The context, the way that his words were presented, it was just simply false. And so they had sort of fabricated a scandal out of this interview. And a lot of the people, I think... I may be wrong, who were involved in that, I think are still employed by the New Statesman. And there were people within the Conservative Party, so very much like Timon of Athens. Roger, he'd been appointed to this commission for building beautiful. And many of those in the Conservative Party who should have stood up for him, the most preeminent Conservative philosopher, not only of a generation, but up there with great philosophers like Kant or Descartes. He's one of our great thinkers. Yes. And the Conservative Party turned their back on him in his time of trouble instead of standing by him. And it was Douglas who secured that recording and vindicated him at the end of his life.
Douglas Murray. And Kevin Spacey, in that soliloquy from Timon of Athens, talks about the leaves that have before stuck to the oak tree, and they're blown away in one winter's breath, I think is the phrase. In other words, you're hit by a scandal, all the support that you've had, all the friendship tends to disappear in that moment. Interestingly, Spacey is now involved in a new film. I think it's called Control. And one cinema, straight away, the Prince of Wales Theatre, has said that its staff were horrified by the connection with Spacey. And so the showing was cancelled. Another cinema has been found. And I suppose one of the hazards that Spacey now faces is that although he's not been found, although he's been cleared of all charges, if he were to appear on a stage, there could be a demonstration in the audience against him, which would have a most unfortunate effect. Your reflections on that? How does a person who's been cancelled, although never successfully prosecuted, how does such a person move forward?
Well, this is despite the fact that, of course, he's been vindicated by the law. And I think it's a cultural problem that when accusations like this are made, that people are not presumed innocent until proven guilty, and that even when they are proven innocent, that those still hang over their heads and damage their careers. And this was a point that Douglas Murray made in his tribute to Roger, which is that this is the way that we treat the greatest among us, our greatest philosopher, one of our greatest actors. And they can have their career destroyed with one winter's breeze, as you just said there. And how do people move forward after cancellation? I think that there are an awful lot of very talented people who are now on the wrong side of being cancelled. And there will be many people who are, particularly within the arts, who want to create good art but are stifled in their ability to do that. And so I think that the way to move forward after cancellation is it's a collective endeavour. I think you have to have good people around you, as Roger and Kevin had, you know, the great friend in Douglas Murray, and many of those who do get cancelled find out who their real friends are. And actually, although Timon of Athens, his friends all abandoned him, and there's a beautiful line in there that wasn't able to be fit into that clip, I think, where he very passionately talks about the jurors on thy life of your peers around you. And I think Timon of Athens did have one friend in that play who did stick by him. And he had a servant who did stick by him. And I think it's those people who stand by you when you lose everything that make all of the difference. And I think we have seen many people who have been cancelled vindicated insofar as it's possible when the world has turned against them.
So, very interesting thought there, that those of us who may be the leaves on the oak, in other words, the friends of people who find themselves in difficulty, maybe we should think about how we can stick with those people. Thank you, Emma Webb, for that eyewitness account of Kevin Spacey's performance. In a few minutes, Stefan Kyriazis will don his blue suede shoes to tell us about a trove of Elvis artefacts that has made its way to London.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to ordinary people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquia, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Welcome back. Stefan Kyriazis has graced us with his presence. And Stefan, you've had quite a busy week, including going to an Elvis exhibition.
Yes, Graceland has come to London, and it's absolutely extraordinary. Brand new space in London Bridge, which is wonderful. It's a huge exhibition space, 5 big, massively vaulted rooms, absolutely stuffed to the rafters with Elvis memorabilia. A lot of it has never been out of the country. A lot of it's never been out of Graceland or Elvis's bedroom. So this is very exciting. It's a major, major event. And a lot of it is very much Elvis the star. So you have rooms with wraparound concert screens. You've got all those amazing jumpsuits with rhinestones and beading and all those sorts of things. There's a red MG from Blue Hawaii, one of his films. So a real sense of what a massive star he was. But for me, the absolute joy are all the things that paint the picture of who he was as a man. There's really personal things there, from as a child, all his school documents and pictures. But there's lots of stuff that people may not know, that he was obsessed with law and order. So he was friends with a lot of police forces. So he had a uniform and a cap and an honorary badge, and he had a blue light to put on his car when he was driving around. So this is amazing. Or judo, honorary, again, black belt, but his judo costume, American football costumes, a real sense of who he was. And then if you go to Graceland, you never go upstairs. It's absolutely off limits. So even Baz Luhrmann, when he was making the film, could take notes, couldn't film or take pictures up there. It's absolutely off limits. So stuff is never seen. And we have his gold telephone that was from the room. We have the Jesus statue that was by his bed. And then for me, wonderfully, his record player, which was the last record he ever listened to. It was by a band called The Sparks, a demo. That record player is there with the acetate on it, and it absolutely gives you goosebumps, a real sense of the man.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic. Have you been to Graceland? I've been to Graceland.
I have not. My colleague has.
No, I've been to Graceland. What I think the main thing you're struck by is how small it is. Yes. He acquired it quite early on in life. And, you know, his perception of grandeur, I think, when he was quite a young man, was quite limited in a way. But also, he very much wanted it to be his family home, and he wanted to go on living a kind of fairly ordinary life. I mean, obviously, by then, he had a lot of money and so on. But in itself, it's a very touching place. And as you say, they've been very careful about his privacy. And suddenly, this great exception to his privacy, which is that all this memorabilia has pitched up in London.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, always there's Graceland always has different exhibitions on at Graceland, and occasionally touring things around the world. But there's such a resurgence in Elvis. And I also wanted to bring up that there's a huge concert tour of the UK, so everybody outside London as well. Kicks off on October the 25th.
What do you mean a concert tour? Elvis is dead.
So it's Elvis on screen. They're very clear at the moment they don't want to do a hologram with him, and also they have a problem because there's no physical things that they can 3D map. So he's on the massive cinema screen in these huge venues. Royal Philharmonic, thank you very much, playing the music underneath him. Opens in Glasgow on the 25th. It's going to Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, Birmingham, and then to the O2. So it's very much Elvis at the moment. He's back on top.
Very good indeed. And the exhibition is at London Bridge.
It's at the Arches at London Bridge, and at the moment booking to February.
A new venue. You've also been to see a ballet. It's a ballet about Jacqueline Dupre, the cellist who was married to Daniel Barenboim, who unfortunately died very young, and her life has been converted into a ballet. It's called The Cellist, and we could take a look. the cellist, the Royal Ballet at Covent Garden?
Yes, that's at Covent Garden. That's booking through till November at the moment.
And I think we were listening there to Elgar's cello concerto.
Yes, we are, with one of the dancers actually as the cello, which is how the piece was created. And that's Marcelino Sambe. Lauren Cuthbertson is playing Dupré, and that was Daniel Barenboim there as well, which is Matthew Ball. Absolutely extraordinary, beautiful piece. And I have to say, the drama later on, when the multiple sclerosis starts affecting her and she loses her abilities with the man as he's her cello, but also the muse, the music, her spirit. It's absolutely heartbreaking and beautifully acted, beautifully danced, but wonderfully acted as well. It's tremendously moving, a beautiful piece.
Goodness, that's a must. We just have time for a briefish mention of Dear England, which is a play about Gareth Southgate, basically. Yes.
Joseph Fiennes playing the England manager, and it's very much about how he rebuilt the culture of sport, teamwork, masculinity, how we view ourselves and our teams, and it's his famous Dear England letter that he wrote in 2021, just before the Euro Cup, which obviously ended with that penalty shootout and a huge outpouring of hatred for some of the players. But then there was a backwash and a changing in people's opinions of, hey, these are people. And the show is very much about that. And it's very serious themes, but it's also thrillingly exciting. It's fun, which is what I love about shows. Don't just give me issues. Entertain me as well and make me care and move me. Fantastically staged. You get penalty strikes, penalty shootouts. There's booming music. The stadium is recreated, massive screens around you. Joseph Fiennes in the lead role is extraordinary. And also the guy playing Harry Kane, the England captain, steals the show. Very much played for comedy, his very awkward way of talking. But in the second half, he expresses that I know people laugh at me, I know they make fun of me, but he's just a very decent man and he's the absolute heart and soul of the team. And the whole thing moves you and you see these men as people and you think about how we behave as well. It's brilliant. Please go and see it.
Which theatre?
Prince Edward.
Prince Edward in London. Thank you, Stefan. A very varied programme you introduced us to there. Well, that's it for the first hour of Sunday with Michael Portillo, but please don't run away. I'll be back in a few minutes, and it will be time to speak with travel writer Ben Aitken.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. I'm Craig Snell. Well, looking ahead to today, most of us, it's a much drier picture. Still a few showers around, and that's all courtesy of this rather complex area, low pressure. But the main area of low pressure, which has been responsible for the very heavy rain over the last few days, has now finally cleared to the north. So as I mentioned, most of us are largely dry, some good spells of sunshine, especially across eastern parts of the country. Further west, a few showers. Some of these could potentially be on the heavy side, especially across the very far south of England, and quite blustery too still for the very far north of Scotland. But for most of us, temperatures around where they should be for the time of year, 10s to 12s in Scotland, potentially up to around 15 or 16 degrees in southern England. So as we go into this evening, clearing skies across the board, so recipe for a clear and chilly night. Could turn quite frosty for Scotland, and after the very wet weather what we've had here, we could see some icy patches too, maybe also parts of northern England, and just watching out for a few showers for Northern Ireland. So starting Monday morning, watch out for some icy stretches for parts of Scotland and northern England. But most of us starting dry. A few mist and fog patches first thing. Still the risk of some showers for Northern Ireland, maybe just creeping into parts of Western Cornwall too. But I think for most of us, it should be a dry and bright day. And once again, temperatures around where they should be for the time of year. 10s to 12s in the north, potentially 16 in the south.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Oh!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
The Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Good afternoon and welcome back. This is the second hour of Sunday with Michael Portillo. Augment your afternoon as we celebrate history, travel and good debate. The government has scrapped the Birmingham to Manchester leg of the HS2 railway, but the thorny question remains of what to do with all the land that was compulsorily purchased for the route. The Times reported this week that the Treasury plans to sell it off at a £100 billion loss to the taxpayer, a decision variously described as spiteful and scorched earth by those who hope that the line might still be completed at some point in the future. We'll debate that. Yesterday was Trafalgar Day, a commemoration of the astonishing feat of arms that allowed Britannia to rule the waves, thwarting a Napoleonic invasion of England. What reserves of courage and resilience must it have taken for Nelson's sailors to make the Royal Navy ruler of the high seas? One man who might know is Will Soffrin, who will recount his own maritime adventure sailing an 18th century replica warship through hurricanes towards Hollywood, where it would become the main prop for the 2003 movie Master and Commander. Travel and adventure is also the forte of my final guest today, the author Ben Aitken. His books include A Chip Shop in Poznan and Here Comes the Fun, and he's just returned from a transcontinental railway trip to Istanbul. All of that to come, but first your latest headlines with Sophia Wensler.
Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 12. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. Israel has issued an urgent warning to residents in northern Gaza, telling them to move south. It follows another night of airstrikes. The health ministry in Gaza says 266 Palestinians, including 117 children, have been killed in the past 24 hours. Leaflets and phone messages warn those who stay in the north could be seen as sympathisers with a terrorist organisation and are putting their lives in danger. Israel Defence Forces spokesman Colonel Peter Lerner says Israel only targets Hamas.
We know how extensive their tunnel mechanisms is and how they are operating and using them. So we're confident we have good intelligence, but the realm of warfare is it's not the known knowns, it's the unknown knowns. And so we know that we have a brutal enemy. We don't know exactly what they're doing. We have a good grasp of their operational capabilities, and we need to confront that and remove that as if it was a tumor.
Former head of the Palestinian diplomatic mission to the UK, Manuel Hassassian, says he still believes in a two-state solution.
Don't try to put us, all in a frame that we are terrorists as Palestinians. There is a difference between the Palestinian people who want peace and security, and there is a difference between the Palestinian Authority, which is the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, who believe in a two-state solution, who have condemned violence all along. The question is, can Israel stop state terrorism on equal basis? That's a question.
Meanwhile, the United Nations says a second convoy of aid could be delivered to Gaza today. 20 trucks were allowed to enter the Strip when the Rafah crossing on the border with Egypt was opened for a few hours yesterday. The UN says 100 trucks are needed each day to meet the essential needs of Palestinians. Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick says diplomacy is key.
What we should be doing is using the assets of the UK, which is our relationships with countries like Egypt and Israel, and our development aid to support as many vulnerable people as possible in Gaza, rather than creating small schemes to privilege a small number of people. The priority is to get the British nationals out and humanitarian aid in a way which means it is not diverted and abused by the terrorist organisation Hamas.
Violence in the region is spreading, with Israel launching airstrikes in the occupied West Bank. A compound beneath a mosque in the Yenin refugee camp was hit. The Israeli military claims it was being used by militants to organise attacks. Palestinian medics say 2 people were killed and several others injured. Police believe a woman in her 80s has died as a result of flooding in Chesterfield. The discovery of her body brings the total number of people who've died during Storm Babette to 4. Floods are still affecting parts of the UK, including Yorkshire, Scotland, East Anglia and the East Midlands. The Environment Agency says there are 3 severe flood warnings in place in Derbyshire. Meteorologist John Hammond says that even though the rain has stopped, rivers are still overflowing.
The Derwent is extraordinarily high, and that bulge of floodwater has got to work its way down through the Trent. So through the Trent, for example, and other larger catchments across northern and eastern Britain, that bulge of floodwater has got to work its way down towards the seas. So Environment Agency flood warnings are still extensive, but certainly from midweek onwards, it doesn't look pretty weather-wise. What we really want is a week or 2 of dry, settled, crisp autumn weather. That is not what we're going to get. We're going to get a lot more rain.
Manchester United will open a book of condolence for fans at Old Trafford following the death of Sir Bobby Charlton. He was a key member of England's World Cup winning team in 1966. United players wore a black armband for their game against Sheffield United last night, and the club says he will always be remembered as a giant of the game. Former England manager Sam Allardyce paid tribute to his kindness.
He was a great ambassador for Manchester United and a great ambassador for football and England, and such a kind person. I think that's what everybody as tribute is explaining to. What a great guy he was, what a contribution he made to football for England and for Manchester United. And of course, as a youngster, I watched him in the World Cup final on my black and white TV at the time all those years ago. But it was a pleasure to know him. Every time I went to Old Trafford, he'd stop and have a chat with you.
This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on your digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back to Michael.
Thank you, Sophia Wensler. When the Romans, under Scipio Aemilianus, finally defeated Carthage, the city was razed to the ground and the fields salted to prevent any civilization ever re-emerging. Rishi Scipio Sunak's critics accuse him of adopting a similar approach to HS2, since the Birmingham to Manchester leg was scrapped at the Conservative Party conference earlier this month. According to The Times, the government now proposes to sell off the land that it had purchased for the line at a loss to the taxpayer of £100 billion. The Sunday Times Insight team today reports that managers at HS2 deliberately hid costs from ministers and sacked whistleblowers. To debate whether or not the selling off of the land is wise, I'm joined by the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Mark Littlewood, and policy researcher at the think tank Britain Remade, Ben Hopkinson. Welcome to you both. Mark, I think you're of the view that the land can be sold off. Would you like to explain that?
Yes, I mean, this has been a sorry saga really from the start, Michael. I mean, the cost overruns, I think initially the budget for the entirety of HS2 was about 30 billion. My own think tank said we think it might cost as much as 80 billion. Even we at the Free Market Institute of Economic Affairs understated the overrun in this budget. So the mission now, with it effectively being cancelled, or rather the extension of it being cancelled from Birmingham, recoup everything we can for the taxpayer. We're not going to be able to make up all of the losses, but anything we can in some sort of fire sale from the acquired assets should be done. I would just say on the land, I mean, you're right, it would effectively be salted if it was sold off and developed. The HS2, for those for which it is a dream, will never be able to live their dream, but for those for which it is a nightmare, it would be a rather good news that it couldn't be extended. But we could probably be imaginative about it. You don't just need to sell off the land as agricultural land. You could probably sell it off with planning permission to develop on it, for example. That would make the land much more valuable. So the taxpayer is going to be heavily out of pocket, but the government's job is to minimise that loss from here.
I perfectly understand that the project has been a disaster. It's been hugely mismanaged, it's well over budget, and it doesn't bear comparison with foreign examples, which otherwise are very close examples. OK, all that understood. But are we to resign ourselves to the thought that Britain can never have a modern network of railways when nearly every one of our competitors around the world has made the decision that high-speed rail is an important part of a 21st century economy?
Well, I think you've got to do it much more cheaply than we have then. Perhaps that is more brutal rules on planning. I mean, I'm sure the HS2 group will say, well, the costs have accelerated because we can't offend this local community, so we're going to have to build a tunnel, and it goes onwards and onwards and upwards and upwards. But you're right to compare the costs. I mean, I think per mile, this is about 9 or 10 times the equivalent cost of something in France. I mean, not a little more expensive, a factor of 10. Absurd. I mean, but
if you sell off the land, what you're saying is that the British are never capable of improvement. I mean, you would think that if we simply got the French to come and build our railways for us, that they could do it at a decent price.
Well, maybe we should have done that at the outset.
Maybe we should, but you see, you are admitting the possibility that it could be done more cheaply, and I entirely agree with that. But if the land has gone, you close down that possibility.
Well, if the French believe it can be done more cheaply, why don't they make a bid for the land and go and build some rail on it? I mean, I'm happy for a market solution here. I don't believe that I know in my head the exact optimal rail outlets for the entirety of the United Kingdom. I'm not against it being sold off to the private sector to build rail on it. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. But if, in fact, there's more demand for, I don't know, housing or roads, it should be sold off for that purpose.
Ben, I'm rather hoping you take a contrary point of view, do you?
Yes.
Why?
I think selling off the land in a fire sale of government assets, which will probably end up costing the taxpayer £100 million, is just not the right solution forward. I think the government should really be focusing on how to lower those transport infrastructure costs. And keeping the land is key to that, especially the land around Euston Station. If they cut the land and sold it, you'd reduce the new platforms from 10 to 6, which would mean that effectively you'd never get up to the capacity of what's already been built on HS2 Phase 1 to Birmingham. And that's really going to permanently affect our ability to build high-speed rail. So selling off the land quickly at a fire sale is not the right way forward.
I must say the announcement has astonished me, because although clearly this government has no intention of revisiting the issue, but this government may only be here for another year, Two, to use the Roman example in Carthage, to actually close down the possibility of ever doing it again does seem, to me, extraordinary. And we end up then with a little bit of railway line between London and Birmingham, which nobody in their right mind would ever propose as a total project, and no possibility of extending it further north. And you're also raising the issue that we can't build a Euston station of the proper size. It does seem a very odd decision. Is there a bit of pique involved in this, do you think?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think the West Coast Main Line is still going to be the busiest mixed-use line in Europe, with freight trains and passenger trains congesting, leading to delays for passengers. Euston last week alone was shut temporarily for overcrowding, and these issues are going to continue unless we find a way to drive down the transport infrastructure costs and building cheaper so we can build more capacity to our rail lines, which are effectively Victorian.
I mean, I think what's happened here is that the government and society has been hoodwinked by the environmental lobby because, we built motorways without all these protections of putting most of it in tunnel. Why? Because people thought, I could benefit from a motorway because I might have an exit fairly near me, which would help me to make quick journeys. But in the case of the railways, and I think for no better reason than that many people along the line didn't see a benefit to themselves, we've pushed it into tunnel, we've pushed the costs up enormously, and then, of course, people gleefully say, aha, now it's too expensive to build. I mean, we just do need a different approach, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. From the outset, the design was going to be far too expensive. I read that of the 45-minute journey from Euston to Birmingham, you're going to be in a tunnel or a cutting, effectively not seeing sunlight, for about 38 of the 45 minutes, so only at level ground for 7 minutes. And that's an incredible addition of expense, which means from the outset, you're not going to be building as cheap as Western European comparators. So we can build cheaper, we just need to think about the design ahead of time.
Mark, you were talking a moment ago about, believing in commercial projects, that if someone wanted to come and build a railway, all well and good. But you and I know that railways don't pay for themselves, and there are things called externalities. In other words, there are benefits to the community, to the economy and so on, which have to be borne collectively. Now, what I worry about is British exceptionalism. There are people who think that whilst France and Germany and Japan and China and Spain and Morocco have all seen the need for high-speed rail, we, the British, exceptionally, can get by with our Victorian infrastructure.
Yes, it's a fair point. And look, I won't be a complete purist about this, Michael. It does seem that these grand projects, although I would like to test them on whether private equity came forward to pay for the whole bill, no, they potentially need state involvement. You're right about externalities, but you know what? Practically everything in life has an externality. I mean, if a nice new restaurant opens up near my flat, the value of my flat goes up, but I'm not going to pay for the nice new restaurant to open. So all I'm looking for here is at least a signal that there's some private sector interest. If Ben is right, and, merely by completing the Old Oak Common to Euston bit, we can get, this huge capacity of the line, great. Where's private equity to at least back some of it? So even if, I'm not going to take the wholly market purist line that every last penny must be paid for by private enterprise, let's at least have some pennies by private enterprise. And if those pennies are not coming forward, it tells you something about the viability of the project.
The pennies will have to be quite big. Ben, did you have a reaction to, I don't know whether you've seen it, this Insight team investigation in the Sunday Times, that people at HS2 were busy hiding the real costs from ministers because they could see their project would get cancelled if it got too expensive, and firing the whistleblowers? I mean, this really needs to be looked into, doesn't it?
Yes, certainly. I think a lot of that comes down to the way that the civil service interacts with the arm's-length body that's building the railway itself, and not having the proper oversight or experience or even kind of capability to make sure that the people who are meant to be delivering the railway are delivering it to budget, to time, and making sure that they're holding private contractors to account to avoid unnecessary overcharges or expenditure. And by failing to do that, by moving around, by not having the experience necessary to manage these kind of quite complex relationships, it's obvious that there's been an oversight here, and whistleblowers being fired is obviously the worst possible outcome that you could have on that.
I've made this point before on GB News, but it strikes me as absolutely amazing that, to the best of my knowledge, during all of this business, we've never heard the name of a responsible person. Never hear the name of the permanent secretary at the Department of Transport. Never hear the name of the person who's supposedly in charge of HS2. There just seems to be no accountability in the thing from top to bottom. And in the end, I think I'll say to you that the lack of accountability is probably as important a factor in the costs going up as the fact that environmentalists have pushed much of it underground. Thank you very much for that debate, Mark Littlewood and Ben Hopkinson. After the break, the celebration of Trafalgar Day leads us to speak to a man who sailed an 18th century replica warship through hurricanes, all for the sake of a Hollywood blockbuster.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. I'm Craig Snell. Well, looking ahead to the forthcoming week, and for most of us, unfortunately, it is staying unsettled. Further spells of wind and rain to come. But for now, this area low pressure, which has been responsible for the very heavy rainfall, has now cleared. But unfortunately, further areas of low pressure are waiting in the Atlantic. But back to this evening, for most of us, it should be a fairly dry and clear night. Perfect recipe for a chilly night, actually, especially for Scotland, Northern England. Could see a widespread frost, and after the very wet weather what we've had, could just see some icy stretches. So just do take care if you are out and about. Could just see a few showers for Northern Ireland, may just creep into parts of Western Cornwall too, but elsewhere, a dry start to the day. Could just see a few mist and fog patches first thing too, but really it's going to set us up for a largely dry picture. Best of the sunshine as we go through the course of the day will be across parts of Scotland and Northern England. Still the risk of some rain just moving into Northern Ireland and the far west of Cornwall at times, and for most of us temperatures very similar to recent days, 10s to 12s in the north, potentially up to 15 to 16 degrees in the south. Looking ahead to Tuesday, a band of rain will spread its way northwards during the course of the day, so fairly wet affair for a good chunk of the UK, potentially staying dry for most of the day in Scotland, but unfortunately middle of the week stays fairly unsettled for all of us.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to ordinary people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only three people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Acquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Welcome back. Yesterday was Trafalgar Day, marking 218 years to the day since Admiral Horatio Nelson defeated a combined French and Spanish fleet, heading off Bonaparte's invasion plans and securing British naval supremacy for a century. The Age of Sail left a legacy of rich literature, which reached its peak with the brilliant Aubrey Maturin adventure series by Patrick O'Brien. When those books were turned into a movie, Master and Commander, in 2003, a ramshackle crew was assembled to sail an 18th century replica warship from Rhode Island all the way to Hollywood, inadvertently recreating the very adventures that O'Brien had depicted in his stories. One of that crew was Will Soffrin, who's turned his tale into a book called All Hands on Deck. Will joins me now. Will, welcome to GB News. Just to begin with, what would be the differences between the replica ship and the original warship? Did you have modern devices on board? Did you have more room? Was it as well built as the original?
Hey, Michael, thanks for having me. Well, let's see, to jump right in, I mean, there's a lot there. We definitely had modern amenities such as engines, electricity, plumbing, and we had one less interior deck than the original Rose would have had. Mainly because of the financing requirement that the replica ship be built to serve as a bit of a restaurant. But I think another key difference is the original HMS Rose sailed with a crew of around 200 men, whereas we did the same with just a crew of 30. So needless to say, we were a bit of a skeleton crew taking on the passage of the ship.
So although you had some modern devices on board, you still had to go up aloft. You had to go to the top of the masts to handle the sails. Is that right? You were sailing with sail power on your 3-masted ship, and you had to be up there, we're seeing a picture of it now, to manage those sails.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we had to learn how they sailed the ship 200 years ago. And having been a professional sailor before hopping on board Replica Rose, sort of the best way to say it was sort of all Greek to me. Sailing and operating a ship like this required a whole different skill set and definitely a specific vernacular that mostly gone extinct. Unfortunately, led around the world, there's tall ship organizations that have carried on the practice, and most, really sort of the benchmark founding was, I believe, Prince Philip, who was really, really behind tall ship sailing.
You were 21 years old at the time, which is pretty young, I think. Almost the first thing that happened to you is you sailed into a hurricane. Tell us about that.
Well, I'll say, fortunately, I was a little naive of the danger of the situation. I really sort of enjoyed the roller coaster ride as it was happening and unfolded. But then I was also the ship's shipwright, so I was a carpenter on board. I kind of knew what was going on, sort of your modern day engineer. And I remember going up into our forepeak, which is the bow, and we were taking on so much water that our pumps were running. And I looked and I could see the planking opening up below the waterline, and you could see light coming in. That in itself really kind of clued me in on sort of the heightened danger of the situation that we were in. And then there was another stage in the storm where one of our square sails came unfurled, and because we were on this archaic ship, the only way for us to fix the situation meant to free climb the rig up in the storm to take control of that sail, which is just something that doesn't happen today in modern sailboats. So, I think I had an extremely unique experience having to climb aloft in such a powerful storm and figure out how to get it done.
At one time, I believe you were dismasted. That is to say, you lost a mast.
Yes, that's correct. We were on our second leg sailing through the middle of the Caribbean Sea when we had all of our sails set, and a series of unfortunate events caused an explosion with one of our masts. And so that meant a dismasting, and we quickly had to jump onto our toes and climb aloft again and get up because we wanted to make sure that the rest of the rig didn't come over the side of the ship.
How did you get on as a crew? Were you a jolly team or not so much?
That's a great question. I think I'd be doing a disservice if I said everybody got along just fine. But we had great leadership. Our officers were incredible at pulling everyone together, and we did have moments where we knew that we needed to put our differences aside. But yeah, we certainly had a couple smacks back and forth, but we figured it out.
You risked your life. It was a great adventure, but you did risk your life for the sake of what was effectively a cinema prop. You were sailing a ship all that distance, many thousands of miles, through those hostile seas in order that a movie could be made. Do you think it's sensible to risk your life for a movie?
When I signed on, I didn't know I'd be risking my life to make a movie. But you do what you got to do when you have to get it done, and that's what I signed on for. On hindsight, probably say, well, that was a little bit of a ridiculous or unnecessary risk. But I didn't know. I don't think anybody knew that we'd be going sort of such a risk at that time. But it worked out, and probably I'll say it was one of the most transformative and best experiences of my life. And I wrote this book because I think as many people as possible should get out on a ship like this and go experience the world.
And actually, as you alluded to before, those opportunities are available because youngsters can go on tall ships. There are tall ship races organised all the time. So you are now an author. Do you want to say something about Patrick O'Brien and his qualities as an author with books like Master and Commander?
Patrick O'Brien is a treasure. I read one of his books just when I got offered the job on the ship, and then as my sailing career continued on, I read more. Writing this book required me to research quite a bit about his life, and I mean, just an incredible feat for a man who wasn't a sailor to write so well about the Royal Navy. And even though his book series is a set of fiction books, the accuracy of them is sort of like the film. I think what Peter Weir took on, which was they wanted the books to be and the movie to be a benchmark of history representing the great success of the Royal
Navy. Your book is called All Hands on Deck, and thank you very much for being on GB News, Will Soffrin. A little later, I'll be talking about travel writing with author Ben Aitken. But before that, here's an update on the news from Sophia Wensler.
It's 12:30. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. Israel has issued an urgent warning to residents in northern Gaza, telling them to move south. It follows another night of airstrikes. The health ministry in Gaza says 266 Palestinians, including 117 children, have been killed in the past 24 hours. Leaflets and phone messages warn those who stay in the north could be seen as sympathisers with a terrorist organisation and are putting their lives in danger. These are live pictures of the Rafah crossing on the Gaza border with Egypt. The United Nations is hoping the gates will be reopened so that more aid can be delivered. 20 trucks carrying desperately needed supplies were allowed to enter the strip yesterday. Police believe a woman in her 80s has died as a result of flooding in Chesterfield. The discovery of her body brings the total number of people who've died during Storm Babette to 4. Floods are still affecting parts of the UK, including Yorkshire, Scotland, East Anglia and the East Midlands. The Environment Agency says there are 3 severe flood warnings in place in Derbyshire. Manchester United will open a book of condolence for fans at Old Trafford following the death of Sir Bobby Charlton. He was a key member of England's World Cup winning team in 1966. The club says he will always be remembered as a giant of the game. And you can get more of all these stories by visiting our website at gbnews.com. Now it's back to Michael.
As we just heard, tributes are being paid to Sir Bobby Charlton, who has died at the age of 86. He was a key member of England's World Cup winning team in 1966 and a club legend at Manchester United. His family said that he passed away peacefully in the early hours of yesterday morning. Geoff Hurst, now the last of the 1966 team, said he'll be sorely missed by all of the country. My own outstanding memory is from my childhood. My brother Justin was a Manchester United fan. I recall that dreadful day in February 1958 when the aircraft carrying the team back from Munich crashed on takeoff. 23 were killed, including many members of the team. My brother was devastated and my home was plunged into gloom. Bobby Charlton survived. What trauma he must have suffered is hard to understand. Our reporter Ellie Costello looks back at his life and career.
The greatest moment in English football. Sir Bobby Charlton following captain Bobby Moore to collect the 1966 World Cup trophy from the Queen at Wembley. The defining moment in the career of one of England's greatest footballers.
I'm a football romantic. I love football. And there are millions like me, to which this place is the focal point of the whole world. You know, you speak to people like Pelé, and Beckenbauer, and the highlight of their careers was when they played at Wembley for the first time.
Born the son of a coal miner in Northumberland in 1937, Bobby said the only choices open to him were the mines, the navy, or football. Thankfully for the world, he pursued the latter. Charlton's death leaves Sir Geoff Hurst as the only surviving member of the team that won the World Cup. At just 20 years old, a young Bobby Charlton was one of the Busby babes involved in the 1958 Munich air crash. He survived, although 23 lives were lost, including those of 8 United team members. Up until his own death, he remained the last surviving member of that crash.
A fine centre, and Bobby Charlton slams the ball home.
Bobby Charlton was named in the England squad for 4 World Cups. At the time of his retirement from the England team in 1970, he was the nation's most capped player, having turned out 106 times at the highest level. With 249 goals, he was Manchester United's highest all-time goal scorer for more than 40 years. He was also England's highest goal scorer for 45 years. In a glittering career, Sir Bobby won 3 league championships, an FA Cup and a European Cup with Manchester United. He remained a director at the club for many years.
Bobby Charlton was the player who gave us that elite world-class quality which enables you to go and win tournaments. And don't forget the soccer school. David Beckham was brought to the attention by his participation and involvement in the Bobby Charlton Soccer School.
In 1994, Charlton became Sir Bobby when he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth, and he continued to act as an ambassador for British sport.
I'm a footballer and just tried my best and hoped that my ability was good enough to get me some success, which I've been lucky enough to have done.
He helped to promote London's successful bid for the 2012 Olympics.
This is such a fun place, and people love London. People love London, and we get them here, and we'll give them such a fantastic time.
In his personal life, Bobby Charlton married his wife, Norma Ball, in 1961. They had 2 daughters, Suzanne and Andrea. In November 2020, it was revealed that Sir Bobby Charlton had been diagnosed with dementia, as did several of his 1966 teammates. He stepped back from public life and has rarely been seen in recent years. So Bobby Charlton will remain a name synonymous with the beautiful game.
A remarkable life and career. In a few minutes, I'll be speaking to the travel writer Ben Aitken, a man after my own heart who's just returned from a transcontinental railway journey across Europe.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the dinosaur hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Ah!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Welcome back. When the Orient Express trains roll back into action in 2025, they'll again trace an epic route that's been a favourite of travellers ever since Patrick Leigh Fermor embarked from the Hook of Holland towards Istanbul back in the 1930s. My next guest has just made the same journey. It's just one of his many travel adventures because Ben Aitken is an author of several books, including Dear Bill Bryson, Footnotes from a Small Island, A Chip Shop in Poznan, and most recently, Here Comes the Fun. Ben, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Tell me about your recent trip on the route of the Orient Express.
It was an interesting, diverting, nourishing, complicated experience like any long train journey. I'm sure you're well aware. Things don't always go perfectly to plan, do they? But the very idea of going from London to Istanbul by train overnight through several countries is thrilling. And any number of niggles are sort of compensated for by just that sheer magic of moving across a whole continent. It was lovely.
You weren't travelling in the luxury of the Orient Express, you were hopping from train to train.
Yeah, this was the budget version, definitely. I was sharing compartments with 6 people. On one occasion, it was a couple of Moldovan dentists and a group of Swiss teenagers, and there was plenty of grist added to the meal.
You love to record conversation. You have a tremendous ear. You just like to write down things that you hear. I don't know whether you embellish them, but I notice in your books that is a thrilling thing to you, to record your amusement in what people say.
Yeah, I love chatting, but also listening to other people's chat, so eavesdropping, essentially. The Grand Tour is probably the best example of that. That's a series of coach holidays I took a couple of years ago with a company called Shearing's budget coach holidays to places like Scarborough, Llandudno, St Ives, and I was surrounded by pensioners, basically, so I was a bit of a fish out of water. But I loved chatting to them, recording their conversations, and rubbing shoulders with them in the hope that something would fall off and land on me, a bit of wisdom. And I think it happened. I met a guy called Gary, if you don't mind me giving an example.
Sure.
A guy called Gary in St Ives. This was the middle of winter, and he was only wearing shorts, and I was curious, and one night I plucked up the courage to ask him about his shorts, and he admitted he's not worn anything but shorts for 60 years. And I said, well, why is that? And he gave it some thought and just said, I find them easier to put on. And I think there's some philosophy in there. I'm not sure what type of philosophy, but there's certainly philosophy. So you learn by sharing experiences with people, and travel is great in testing our preconceptions and adding sort of strings to our bow, and it's great for empathy as well.
I remember when I was at school, we had a visit to the Sixth Form Society by a man called Johnny Spate, who wrote Till Death Us Do Part. And he was coming to a grammar school, and he was a working class man himself. And we said something about, how do you decide what to say? And he said rather aggressively, he said, I listen, don't I? I listen. I stand at the bus stop and I listen. And I think that's what you do, you listen.
I had to do a lot of listening when living with Winnie Carter as well.
I know, tell us about this, yes.
So Winnie, as my late housemate, she was the star, the wandering, brilliant, guiding star of the Marmalade Diaries.
Do hold them up, by all means.
Excuse me.
You're very welcome to.
Here we are. This is the
Marmalade Diaries. Excellent.
So this came out a couple of years ago, and this book was born out of necessity, basically, a set of accidents. I moved in with Winnie into her house in London. She had a spare room, and the rent was £150 a month, which is dirt cheap for London. Yeah. In return, I was doing a few odd jobs, cutting the grass, cooking for her. And then the second national lockdown kicked in 10 days later. So what resulted was a sort of intergenerational Big Brother with 2 contestants, one a grieving, inflexible former aristocrat in her 80s, and the other a sort of working-class millennial snowflake. What could go wrong? Plenty, as it happened, but I did have to do an awful lot of listening, and it was joyful, and it was difficult, and it was always interesting. And so that book was sort of anti-travel, because we couldn't go anywhere. But if there was travel, it was moving towards a particular person. And if it's anything, it's a sort of biography, that book.
Yeah. How do you account for your, what should I say, your empathy with older people? I mean, I was going to say tolerance, but it's beyond tolerance. You actually empathise with older people. How do you account for that?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a premature pensioner. I'm not quite sure how it's happened. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents growing up. One was a big fan of West Ham, still is a big fan of West Ham, unfortunately. Trips out with my grandparents, and I always enjoyed chewing the fat with them. And I think in terms of empathy, in my 20s I worked as a carer. So I was a carer to a lad with a disability, cerebral palsy. And my mum did similar work when I was young. So I don't know how we become the people that we are. It's difficult to measure, isn't it? But there's something to do with that in the books, yeah.
What is it like making a living or trying to make a living as a writer? Describe that experience.
precarious. As I said, throughout my 20s, I was working as a carer and I was just scribbling on the side. And I think you know that you truly love doing something if you're doing it for nothing. And my first book, the Deal Bill Bryson one, which is an absolute homage, parody of Bryson's Notes from a Small Island. That was self-published because I didn't have the courage or gumption to pitch it to publishers and agents and stuff. I just did a crowdfunder and self-published it. And that taught me how to complete something, if nothing else. And then I moved to Poland on a whim just before the referendum in 2016, got a job in a fish and chip shop, of all places, boning cod and peeling spuds, wrote about that experience, and that was the first time I actually had the courage to pitch it to publishers. And so I was about 30 at this point, and that was my first lucky break. And it was a lucky break because I was in the slush pile, what the editors call a slush pile. So all of the unsolicited proposals entered this one inbox, and I was lucky that my subject heading of the email was a little bit risque because the title of the book at the time was 50 Shades of Poland, and I think the editor just saw that and thought this is going to be absolute nonsense, opened the email, read a few chapters, and then it went from there. So I got lucky, really. Yeah. And since then I've been...
Which you need to do, I suppose.
Yeah, you need a bit of luck if you...
And a chip shop in Poznan.
Yeah.
I think maybe your best-known book so far, would you say?
Yeah, probably. My Unlucky Year in Poland, that came out in 2019.
So what was it that the chip shop in Poznan said? Why did it capture a moment here? You say it was connected with the referendum.
Well, it was just before the referendum of 2016, and I thought I would go to Poland in the wrong direction, so to say, and have a look at what the Poles were leaving behind, and maybe come back with a more complicated postcard than what I was seeing in the press. And I wanted to sort of extend my field of interest and affection by travelling to Poland and exploring the country and working there, and that's how it. I don't know. I can't explain its popularity. It's certainly not my best book. I think my best book is probably the one starring Winnie Carter because it wasn't planned and I couldn't ever repeat it. But yeah, I think, which book is it? The Grand Tour is in the process of being made into a film, which is quite exciting / intimidating. No idea who's going to play my nan, Janet, but we'll see what happens.
Is it hitting the jackpot when a book is made into a film?
Pretty much. There are many hurdles that have to be sort of surmounted before it hits the big screen, but there's just so much more money in that industry than in publishing. So even if they start developing a film from a book, you know, you get a tiny percentage of the budget, but because these budgets are whopping, because X needs to be paid this and Y needs that, it's quite a windfall. Yes, so fingers crossed, toes crossed, everything crossed, that actually happens.
You and I met before at a travel writers' festival. Not that I am a travel writer, but I'm involved in travel. What would you describe, what is it about travel, do you think, firstly, that motivates you, and secondly, that makes a good thing to be communicated, whether in a book or in a documentary?
I think it's its diversity, as it's a cluster of diversions. It's nourishing, it's challenging, it's social, it's adding grist to the mill, it's all sorts of things. What do you find fun or nourishing about travel? Because you've done so many programmes now. I wonder if the experience of travel for you is being put under pressure by repetition and having to do it so much, or what are the residual joys and delights of travel for you, Mike?
No, do you know, I enjoy it as much now as I did the very first day. I've been making my railway journey for 15 years, and the thrill I get now is as great as at the beginning, possibly more so because I'm more relaxed about it. I love the people that I meet along the way, and our research team find marvellous people. And I think what I particularly enjoy is trying to find a theme to the journey. So, for example, we were filming quite recently in Switzerland. And I thought, you know, what do we know about Switzerland? Well, most extraordinarily, it was never a monarchy. It was never a colonial or imperial power. It's always had some sort of representational basis to its government. it's been neutral since 1815. It is a country of exceptions. And I thought, I need to examine this exceptionalism. I need to take this cuckoo clock apart and look at all the cogs and see how it works, because actually it's a country that works extremely well. So that would just be one example of what I like about travel is I'm already on the journey and I have to find out what the theme is.
Yeah, two big things. People, you mentioned. People make it matter for me. They really do. They sort of elevate any experience to a level from where it can make a deep impression. I mentioned Gary, the philosopher who only wears shorts. I've encountered plenty of such people on my travels. Another was Jill. I was on a coach holiday in Italy, and we pulled up outside George Clooney's house, and I watched Jill, out of the corner of my eye, stealthily remove her bra, wander up to the perimeter of his garden and toss it in. And when I asked her, Jill, why on earth did you do that? She gave it some thought and said, I've got plenty of others. Again, a little bit of philosophy that adds something to one's character.
Well, your books are absolutely full of these one-liners. You have a very good sense of humour yourself. You obviously enjoy other people's sense of humour. The unexpected things they say and the extraordinary non-sequiturs. Or maybe they're not non-sequiturs, maybe they are, as you say, just a philosophy of life. But anyway, Ben, been very good to talk to you. So just to remind people that your new book is called Here Comes the Fun, and it's by...
A Year of Making Merry. And that's
A Year of Making Merry.
And that's an investigation into the serious business of having a laugh.
Very good. Well, good luck with that book. I hope you have a great success with it. Now, Emily Carver will be taking over in a few minutes. Emily, do you want to whet our appetites and tell us what you've got coming up?
Yes, I've got a fantastic panel with me today. I want to focus on the protests at the top of the show that were held yesterday. We're going to be speaking to a former police officer who's going to give us an idea of how the police go about policing these types of massive demonstrations. We heard from the police. They estimated about 100,000 people were out in central London. There were also protests going on in other cities across the UK, including Cardiff, including Glasgow, Leeds, Birmingham, across the country, really. And I want to know, how do the police police these types of demonstrations? I also want reaction to the fact that there was, unfortunately, quite radical Islamist groups on our streets as well. How should the reaction from the police be to that? They seem to have gotten away with it with a slap on the wrist. Should there be a harsher punishment for people who are waving flags of such groups in our central city? So we'll be looking at that. It's a difficult one. Where does freedom of speech lie when it comes to these types of demonstrations?
Emily, do you have considerable sympathy for the police? I mean, it's now become a modern trope to bash the police almost whatever it is doing. But actually, we ask them to make extraordinary decisions on the spot in many places where the law is not very clear.
I think it's extremely difficult. And of course, there was chanting in foreign languages going on. It takes the police a while to understand exactly what they are seeing. I think there's some confusion when it comes to that. But a lot of people will have seen what they saw on the streets of London and be very upset and distressed that the police did not step in more toughly. So we'll be discussing that. I'm also going to speak to Mark White, actually, our Home and Security editor, who is live from Tel Aviv, to get the very latest on the ground. Fears that this conflict is very much escalating in the Middle East, in the region, but also looking at what's happening here.
Emily Carver, you're up next. I want to thank all of the guests who've been on my programme today. I shall return at the same time next week. Until then, bye-bye.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. I'm Craig Snell. Well, looking ahead to the forthcoming week, and for most of us, unfortunately, it is staying unsettled. Further spells of wind and rain to come. But for now, this area low pressure, which has been responsible for the very heavy rainfall, has now cleared. But unfortunately, further areas of low pressure are waiting in the Atlantic. But back to this evening, for most of us, it should be a fairly